are the Church of the Larger Fellowship, a Unitarian Universalist congregation with no geographical boundaries. We believe in cultivating curiosity and transformation that is rooted in profound love. The COVID-19 pandemic has irrevocably shaped how connections are formed in congregations across the United States and the world. The Church of the Larger Fellowship is committed to being a resource within Unitarian Universalism and beyond. From worship to covenant groups, from classes to pastoral care, and from our monthly magazine Quest to our online community hub and our letter writing ministry, we have found ways to build connection and community even through the screen. We have been a model for ministry on the margins, providing services for isolated Unitarian Universalists, becoming a spiritual lifeline for our members in prison. The CLF supports the ministries of those who hold target identities: Blue, Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism; Trust, Transgender Religious UU Professionals Together; and Drum, Diverse Revolutionary Unitarian Universalist Multicultural Ministries, just to name a few. We know better than anyone how deep and meaningful connections can be formed, even from a distance. Unitarian Universalists have faced many challenges in these times, and we continue to persevere and fight for justice and equity for all people, especially during moments of crisis. We are proud to be a leader in this faith movement, and we invite you to get involved in our ministry. We strive to be a place where anyone from anywhere can find spiritual refuge anytime they need it. Welcome to the Church of the Larger Fellowship. We are so excited to bring you an all-new episode of The View. The View is a weekly Unitarian Universalist talk show discussing important faith-based topics from an anti-racist, anti-oppressive, and multicultural perspective. Every Thursday for the past 7 years, we have welcomed guests from every corner of the world. Our guests are writers, scholars, activists, and religious thought leaders who are shaping Unitarian Universalism and society for the 21st century and beyond. I hope today's show inspires you. Hope it builds your faith. Hope it gives you perspective to see the power of Unitarian Universalism at work in your life. Enjoy the message.
Welcome to another episode of the Voices of Unitarian Universalism. Welcome to our viewers out there. It is good to be with you. Looking forward to yet another wonderful conversation this week. I'm the Reverend Dr. Michael Tino, 1/3 of the lead ministry team at your Church of the Larger Fellowship. And I am coming to you from Peekskill, New York, about 35 miles north of New York City. On the land of the Kitchewan, Wappinger, and Munsee Lenape peoples, where it is taking a break from fall for the day. It was a beautiful, crisp, bright fall, and some front came through, and it's 85 degrees today. And I don't even know. I don't even know what to do with that, because my dear child, happy Halloween, viewers. My dear child is going as a big fuzzy brown spider for Halloween. I need your hat, Aisha. And her costume weighs like 45 pounds and is like thick fur.
Oh no!
Oh no!
Like I'm just gonna put her in like a t-shirt and shorts under it.
Oh no!
And
Oh dear!
Pull up her sleeves, her 8 sleeves.
Maybe you can get those little personal fans to put in the other sleeves.
That's what we're gonna need. That's what we're gonna need. How are you, DC?
Hi, Michael. I am well. I am DC Fortune. I am coming to you from central Pennsylvania, which is ground zero for political stuff right now. Holy crap. I now know what New Hampshire feels like during primary season. Yes, I am in the land of the Susquehannock people. And what else? Oh, yes, I am a fat, white, balding, gray-haired trans man with glasses and wearing a Hawaiian shirt-ish for the very last, very warm day of the year, because it's about 80 here, too. Yeah. Aisha, how are things in Seattle? Foggy and wet, I imagine?
I mean, yes. I'm Aisha Hauser. My pronouns are she and her. And I am in Seattle, the land of the Coast Salish people. And I am a middle-aged brown woman with today wearing a spider on my head on top of my black salt and pepper curly hair. And I'm wearing a keffiyeh, the symbol of liberation for the Palestinian people. And it is Seattle, very much Seattle weather. It is, I walked Gracie, my skinny cow dog, pretty early this morning. It was super dark. So I actually wore what usually people wear hiking in the dark, I guess, or camping, a headlamp. And then by the time I got back, within about a half an hour, it was the sun had started to sort of peek through the clouds. But it is Halloween. Happy Halloween. I am going to a burlesque show tonight, a gay burlesque show by the same troupe that does Jingle All the Gay, which I've gone to for the last 10 years in Seattle during Christmas. So I'm very much looking forward to being in Capitol Hill in Seattle, which is one of our more festive neighborhoods. And yeah, so I'm
That
yeah,
sounds awesome.
It's awesome.
That sounds like so much more fun than trick-or-treating with a sweaty autistic spider.
I mean, Michael, I feel so much. Remember we were kids, we had freezing nights, right? Like I wore a costume where I'd have to wear, and I'd be so mad that I had to wear a coat because it was the only holiday that the Americans, celebrated.
That's why I bought her like a fuzzy brown spider costume.
Oh,
It'll be cold. You won't have to wear a coat.
That's right.
Yeah.
Oh no.
Okay.
The thing I want to name is maybe our guest would be interested, but I saw a film yesterday that I've been hearing about for the last few months called Israelism. And it is actually a film by Jewish people, really for other Jewish people, about how Hebrew schools and even Hillels and universities, like the American Jewish community, have very much created a narrative and a story about Israel and Palestine. And I cried through some of it. And one of the lines that's been haunting me is, in order for Israelis to feel safe, Palestinians have to feel unsafe. Because some of the stories they shared were from former IDF soldiers that talked about their whole job in the West Bank was to wake up Palestinians in the middle of the night, to harass children, to be on roofs, to let them know that we're always watching. And there was something so deeply, deeply horrific. We already know there's a genocide happening. This movie began being filmed way before October 7th. So when you're watching it, it really illuminates kind of the mindset of colonialism, of supremacy thinking, which male supremacy is patriarchy, white supremacy subjugates brown and black people. And now you have supremacy thinking that in order for Israel to be safe, I'm putting that in quotes, you have to annihilate and torture and subjugate the Palestinians. And that is what I and many millions and millions and millions of people around the world do not accept as a narrative. So that's my Halloween welcome today.
And our guest is nodding off screen.
Oh, good. So let's bring on our awesome guest.
We saw it a couple months ago, and we're going to be talking about supremacy culture today. So let's just dive into it, if you would, because I would love to hear Nathalie's thoughts on this. Our guest today, and let her in, is Dr. Nathalie Edmond, author of Mindful Race Talk, Building Literacy, Fluency, and Agility. I'll put that up nice on the screen. for those who can see it. Nathalie is a licensed clinical psychologist, experienced yoga teacher, anti-racism educator and consultant, and director of counseling, the Counseling Center at Villanova University. She leads an online community called Anti-Racism Revolution. And Chris is here too. So we get to say hi to Chris at the same time that we're saying hi to Dr. Nathalie Edmond, who
Hey everyone.
get to work with on the UUA's Ministerial Fellowship Committee as well in her copious spare time. And so we were just talking, Chris, about the ways in which white supremacy and other cultures of supremacy work to oppress people in the world. And we thought we'd bring on Nathalie because she is among our experts this week. So welcome. It's good to be with you. Nathalie, you said you saw that movie a couple months ago?
Yeah, I think I saw it at the beginning of the year because I felt like about a year ago, I felt like I, had been deeply rooted in anti-racism, but didn't know enough about Palestine-Israel history. And so I took a deep dive. Like I read books from the Israel Jewish perspective. I read books from Palestinian perspective. I read more books from the Palestinian perspective because that's the story that tends to be invisible or erased, right? Which often happens with marginalized voices. And so somebody of Arab descent talked about, see this documentary, Israelism, and that whole indoctrination, and it just shows how if you are a part of a tribe with ancestral intergenerational trauma, you might only hear one side of the story, right? And thinking it's us versus them versus we share a history in this land together, and how do we find a way for us all to coexist? And I feels like there's not enough of those conversations of how do we coexist? Why does one group have to die or be traumatized in order for another group to have safety?
Yeah, I would love to know your thoughts on so one of there were many chilling moments, and I mean chilling. And the one that really kind of, especially given that our United States election is less than 5 days away, when Abe Foxman, who I think he was the founder of the Birthright Movement or co-founder, or no, AIPAC, he was leader of AIPAC. He said, Donald Trump, I don't think Donald Trump is anti-Semitic or racist. And I said, wow, the amount of talk about selling your soul to, and then they juxtapose him saying that, and they show the Charlottesville march where they were white young men, or men probably of any age, but they seem predominantly young, with tiki torches chanting, "Jews will not replace us." So the chilling part of that is, what lengths will you go to maintain this not only narrative, but this culture of, really, it's a death culture and adult culture of torturing the Palestinians, to go to the lengths to deny reality and say, I don't believe Donald Trump is racist or anti-Semitic. I don't know. I'd love to know your thoughts on him, or maybe not that specific, but just.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to wrap one's head around all of this stuff, because I think that the interlocking systems of oppression, the supremacy systems, they're so intertwined. And I think that part of the problem is that there isn't cross-racial, cross-ethno-racial solidarity, right? This idea of we all need to unite in order to dismantle the systems that are doing harm to all of us. There might be an illusion that maybe we're safer, but anti-Semitism has increased significantly in the past year. So it's well, you're not actually safer, right? And so how do we combat anti-Semitism and, Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism? They're all, they're siblings, right? We need to attack them all. And it feels like there's a disconnect, particularly I think amongst people who are Jewish identifying or Jewish allies, not understanding how the fate of these groups are intertwined.
Yes.
It's interesting. I'm listening to this and wondering, I guess I'm wondering how this is rooted, and not how, but I want to like dig into the roots of this in white supremacy culture in particular, especially given your your book, that is trying to help people like have conversations to dismantle that. Because it seems to me that as someone who's not Jewish, but who grew up in Brooklyn, in a largely Jewish community, um, that it's very intimately tied to the ways in which white people, and not all white people, like we'll just say that so you all don't have to get defensive out there, um, but the ways in which white folks have reacted to other people who are not white, BIPOC people being centered in American political discourse, um, by basically saying, "Oh my God, you're attacking me," when it's not attacking them, it's just bringing someone else into the center.
Mm-hmm.
And I hear it again and again. I heard a caller on the radio yesterday who was supporting the former president for re-election, basically saying that as a white person, he feels attacked every time someone supports BIPOC candidates. And I'm like, it seems like these things are very intimately linked to one another. That the feeling that you are being attacked because someone else is being brought into the center has to come from a supremacy mindset.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that in the United States, because whiteness has been the standard and the norm for hundreds of years, right? Since the genocide against the indigenous people, right? That anything then that does not center whiteness or make things colorblind feels like a threat. Right. And I think because like colonialism is so intertwined with white supremacy, that I think that because white people and their ancestors, right, like know that domination and like violence and power over is the way that this land was created, this society was created. They don't know another way. They don't know an abolitionist. They don't know a collaborative, a non-hierarchical. So I think like this idea of if we allow people on the who historically have been on the margins to be centered, so that they can have more access to being able to thrive, that feels so threatening because I think they can only imagine somebody else is on top and somebody else is on bottom. Not that we all share the pie and the pie gets bigger.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was having that exact sort of scarcity model discussion yesterday, and it seems like it's a failure of imagination, being unable to imagine that anyone would respond to a particular set of circumstances in a way different than they would, right? Which is why we've seen straight men get freaked out by gay men, because they can only imagine men as in their own model, which would be sexual predator. And they don't want to be preyed upon. They don't want to be treated like so many straight men treat women. Okay. And they can't imagine that there's a different model, right? They can't imagine that people could share. They can't imagine that people could be generous. They can't imagine that people could be compassionate and loving because of their own very, very small worldview.
Mm-hmm.
So, I wonder if it's that they I hear the lack of imagination but I think people can imagine those things. I think they just can't imagine it for someone else, for someone outside of their quote unquote community. Because, folks, I live in a super, part-time, super rural conservative area, and people take care of each other. And if you look like them, like there is imagination of community care, and what it looks like to take care of one another, where the rubber hits the road is when you have to take care of somebody who doesn't look like you or talk like you or move like you or love like you or express themselves the way that you do. And so that's like, I think people know how to do this. I don't think that it's that they don't know how to do it. I think that they have, that there is an underlying, but going back to what Nathalie was saying, there's an underlying foundational message that the U.S. was predicated on of that we do that for folks who are like us and look like us, and anything other than that is to be feared, is to be othered, is to be dominated and oppressed, and is there for our use, as opposed to embraced for what that other is. And because I don't think BIPOC folks have a monopoly on community care. We've had to do it for different reasons, maybe because we wanted to stay alive in this white dominated United States. But white folks know how to take care of each other. Like, I see it all the time. We see it in Appalachia. We see it, in lots of different spaces. But it's that othering that I don't know what will happen to mine if I expand that care to someone else, because other people are telling me that if I expand that care, bad things will happen and we won't have enough. And I'm not going to have enough to feed my family. I'm not going to have enough to get ahead, whatever that means to you. And that, going back to Aisha's point, that capitalistic, extractive capitalism is always going to separate us into us and them.
And is there a way for us to be different? How do we honor differences? So we don't have to be a melting pot. Like, we can actually be a tossed salad, or like we can honor differences in a way that doesn't other or devalue certain bodies, certain identities. Like, how do we get to that? Because I think the psychologist in me thinks of like trauma responses, right? And like, are we as humans wired for survival to figure out who's the foreigner, who's the different person? Because like, evolutionary wise, like maybe like we need to defend, but like, how do we combat that automatic response of that person is different or foreign, or that culture is not what I'm used to doing? How do we build curiosity? Like, so much of my book is about how do we build curiosity, and how do we move it from an intellectual conversation to a body spiritual? How do we all get free?
Right.
Like, nobody gets left behind.
Yeah, I teach an unconscious bias part of skill building as part of what I do in my consulting work. And that, people want to get to like, how do we eliminate unconscious bias? And the first, I'd say 2/3 of the skill building I do is about how do you recognize in yourself physically when you're uncomfortable, and what do you do with that response? Mm-hmm. Because that, and the second third is the idea that we aren't here to eliminate bias. We're here to override it. Bias is going to happen. It's a physiological response based on fight, flight, or freeze. Our amygdala is going, like, these are things that evolutionarily we've been conditioned to have. And so, like, let's not kid ourselves that we're not going to characterize people. But what do we do with that characterization when we can recognize that that characterization has made us physically uncomfortable? And how do we recognize that part first? Because I can tell you all the ways that people characterize people, but if you don't know how that makes you physically uncomfortable, you're not going to recognize when it's happening, because that discomfort is going to take you to a place that is very difficult to reason your way out of.
Nathalie, I'd love to learn from you really what's the thing in your book that you think people need to pay attention to maybe first? Like, where do you start? Do you start with what Chris is saying? Like, where do you start with in a substantive way? Because here's the thing that research is showing: DEI initiatives have failed. They're failing on a wide scale. I think a big reason why is people just check off the box and like, racism is bad. Okay, we've learned that, rather than what Chris said, because then we're not dealing with how people are uncomfortable. But I'm curious about your approach. I haven't read your book, so I will admit, but I'm curious as to what motivated you to write it, and what is it in it, maybe it's something you have in it that you'd want to share with us that I'd love to hear.
Yeah. Well, the reason I wrote the book is that I spent a number of years doing hundreds of hours of anti-racism workshops, and particularly in the height of the pandemic. And I reached a point where I was like, ooh, this is exhausting, doing anti-racism 101 over and over and over again. And I wanted deeper conversations. And the ways that my workshops have always been different is exactly what Chris was saying, right? It's like, how do we tune into the body, right? Our nervous system responses, like what's like unconscious, and like that could be passed on from our ancestors, from our elders, right? From all of our socialization. So part one of the book was mindfulness, the foundations, like have a practice of some sort that allows you to drop in, to notice where there's tension, where there's unease, where there's ease. And how do we make this, I think of racial justice as a spiritual practice, right? So how do we make this relational? So woven throughout the book is this acronym SIFVB, which is like a quick mindfulness of like, let's tune into your sensations. Let's tune into images, feelings, thoughts, vibe. What's the vibe that you're getting from this conversation, from this space, from this person? Because sometimes we detect like lack of safety just from energy that people are giving off. We don't always have the words. And then how do we then like notice our action urges and what we do next? So much of the book is slowing down, being embodied, getting in touch with how you're feeling. Part two is about, let's explore your racial socialization. We've all been racially socialized. And let's just figure out like how have you been socialized to think about race, to see race? Who do you hang out with? Who did your family hang out with? Who are your teachers? Who have you seen in books and TVs? All those kinds of things. And then let's talk a little bit zooming out. Like what's the racial hierarchy in the United States, right? Whiteness at the top and Black and Indigenous people at the bottom and everybody else in between, right? And that we immigrate here, or we were born here or wherever, and we get indoctrinated into those systems. Like how do we notice anti-Blackness? And how do we do a power analysis? So when you start to bring in all your other identities, how do you know how to be an ally or an accomplice? I want people to move beyond allyship to being co-conspirators. And then part three is agility, right? Mm-hmm. So like, because some people like know the stuff, they learn the checklist, but like the checklist can cause harm if you don't know how to adapt it.
That's right.
For different people, right? And how do we call people in? How do we call people forward? How do we say ouch in a way that allows people's full humanity to be there, so we don't cancel each other, but that we bring people in? Like, I believe you can do better. This is how it landed with me. I'm curious about what your perspective is. And then from there, how do we look at how race is everywhere in our life? You might not have been taught to think that race is everywhere in your life, but it is everywhere. It's in every single institution. White supremacy exists in every institution unless it was created in an anti-racist mindset. And so I want people to digest the book, and then I want them to have conversations with other people about it. no matter what your role is, what your identities are, because so many other books maybe are targeted for white people or white-bodied people, and this book is for all people. We all have work to do to create, anti-racist outcomes.
And I had a congregation, because I do the same work Chris does with consulting, and who came to me and said a social justice committee wants to work on reparations, and they wanted a workshop on reparations. And I literally said, you can't start there. It will be a disaster.
Oh, yeah.
So I literally started with the same thing that you both talked about, you and Chris. I actually don't talk about implicit bias as much, but I start with empathy. What does it mean to have empathy, skill building? And then, we're going to do it over a year. I'm working with this congregation for a year. And then the last 3 workshops are on reparations. But to get there, we're going to talk about empathy, anti-racism, the roots of anti-Black racism, and getting there. And I want, the thing that, where people, I think also my experience has been, as soon as it gets hard, white people stop. As soon as it gets, and I said, we have to go in, what all of us are saying, knowing this is not only going to be hard, it's going to be painful because it's horrific. I always quote Joe Maluo, who says, if you're talking about race and you're comfortable, you're doing it wrong. You're not talking about race. You're simply talking about, you're engaging in an intellectual exercise. I also wanted to ask you if you've read, I just finished The Message by Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, have you read it?
Yep.
And what he does he's doing the sacred work of not only storytelling, but he is using his privilege and being an accomplice, because that man has a lot of social capital. Yep. And I know he's grappled with how much white people like him. Not that he wants white people to not like him, but to be that palatable to white people, is something he's grappled with. So he's using that privilege and saying, you need to pay Israel's apartheid state and pay attention to the Palestinians. And when every single interview he's done, because I'm now obsessed with every interview he's giving, when people say to him, what should happen? What should we do? He says, ask the Palestinians. Ask the Palestinians. And so I'm curious about what your thoughts are on his book, and I'm obsessed right now with Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been watching like every interview.
Me too.
Podcast he's been on, because I agree with you that I think he's a great role model of how to be a co-conspirator.
Yes.
How to use your privilege or your proximity to privilege to amplify the voices of Palestinian people who are being annihilated. Like their perspectives are not even in the room most of the time. And so I think like that, and I think that is uncomfortable for a lot of people. And I think I appreciate the way that he's unapologetic in a grounded way, right? Yeah. He's not shaming people. He's just saying, where are the Palestinian voices? Where are the Palestinian reporters? Talking about apartheid state, right? Like naming things that are in the mainstream culture not talked about. And I highly respect him, because I think about the risk taking, because I think to really be anti-racist or any kind of accomplice requires risk taking. And I think that a lot of people are not willing to take the risks.
I agree.
And one thing that he does particularly well, and maybe we should invite him to be on the show, Aisha.
Yes.
One of the things that he does particularly well, I haven't read The Message yet, but he does this work of noticing where things are landing in his body and writing about it.
Yes.
I don't know if he does this in this book too, but
sure.
I've heard him talk about it in interviews and talk about, sitting with Palestinian people and listening to their story and what that did to him, right? And he notices it in his body. I led a series of workshops with the congregation I served before the Church of the Larger Fellowship, and we started with his book Between the World and Me. I think that's which he wrote for his son. And I started with that because you can't read that book and not have a visceral reaction that you notice.
That's right.
Because he's so clear. He's so clear about what racism does to his physical being. And so we started with that, right? What was the visceral reaction you had when you read about like the things that he writes about. Like, how did that sit in your body? And I made people sit in that discomfort, specifically to notice that, because I needed a book that you couldn't escape that. From that, we couldn't. You couldn't just take that right to the head and just think it. But he's particularly skilled at that.
Well, my favorite is when favorite. That's a wrong word. What I deeply appreciated how when his interview with Ezra Klein, and also each interview, depending on who he's interviewing him, will take the conversation in a different direction. So Ezra Klein particularly kept trying to assert the perspective of what I'm going to call Israeli conditioning. Well, what about this? And Ta-Nehisi very, very calmly said, I don't accept that. I don't accept that. There is no reason. And he would say, I know what this is. I'm a child of Jim Crow. And he talked about his 10 days in Hebron and the occupied territory, especially. He said, I know what this is. I know what this is. I'm a child of Jim Crow. And every time somebody who was, the interviews with Trevor Noah and with Michelle Norris on the Amanpour show were especially poignant to me. Because they got to the heart of what he's talking about, where I found more often than not white interviewers kept wanting to get a gotcha moment, and he would not give it to them because he was so grounded with sacred clarity. I do not accept that. He is not both sides in this, because there is no two sides. There's one side. And well, there are two sides. There's an oppressed side of people who've had a 76-year living with torture and oppression. And so here's the thing that also the Palestinians, and especially during Ferguson, I think it was most public for folks, when the uprising happened in Ferguson and Palestinians were tweeting to protesters how to navigate being hit with tear gas. So I want to, really lift up and ask you, Nathalie, about the connection that has been long-standing between the support for Palestine from especially Black activists over the years, since forever.
Yeah, I mean, and it's been interesting to see kind of like the divide, the division in the anti-racism world among, let's say, Black activists, right? Like those who are very clear about, that you cannot be doing true anti-racism work if Palestinian liberation is not part of that, right? And then others who are like, separating themselves from that. And I when you were talking, I was thinking about how in my book, I talk about like stages of identity development, right? And that to tailor the conversation to where people are in their stages, that's going to be more effective. And I think about the people who are, because mainstream media so effectively only centers the supremacy side, right? And so in this context, right, like I think what's so confusing for so many people, right, is that Jewish people are a marginalized group who have experienced, hundreds of years, thousands of years of oppression. And when you juxtapose them with Palestinian people, they are the one with proximity to privilege and power. And so to be both an oppressed group and the oppressor, I think it's hard for people to hold that you can be both. Right. And I think that what I love about like Black liberation work and like a lot of like true anti-racism work that's centering anti-Black racism is that they see the interconnection. Yes. Right. It's always like, who's at the bottom? Who's the Black or brown or indigenous person who's at the bottom? Like in every power analysis, who is the person who is deemed the Black one, the other one? Right. And in this paradigm, it's absolutely Palestinian people who appear Arab or Muslim. And so I think about those who know those who don't know the truth because they haven't taken the effort to learn what's happening, and those who are too afraid to speak.
Yes.
Right. And I think about that fear, right? Like some people, they could talk about Black Lives Matter all the time, right? They could talk about whiteness all the time, but could they say free Palestine? Like that is like, I think that's what shocked me last fall was that to say free Palestine can get you fired. Yep. Like to think about why are we not rooting for everybody's liberation?
Yes.
Why is this an exception? Why have we spent the last few years saying anti-racism this and anti-racism that, but then here, why does it not apply?
Yes. Yes. Say that. Well, can I please say the line also, God, Ta-Nehisi, your oppression will not save you.
Yes.
Oof, that one, when I tell you, like hits in the solar plexus, because we do it all the time, right? And we talked about this in one of our past shows in the last couple of weeks. Cisgender white gay men are part of the Republican log cabin, or whatever the fuck it is. Like, so just because you've been part of an oppressed group doesn't mean you can't also be an oppressor. So your oppression will not save you. That was so, speak to that, Natalie. Whew.
There was an interview that Ta-Nehisi Coates did with Jon Stewart.
Yes.
And I think Jon Stewart's really good at being a white Jewish accomplice, like trying to speak to like holding that identity, understanding the transgenerational trauma, but also saying, right, like that there's something wrong happening here, that we can all do better. And I really appreciate their conversation because they really talk about like what happens to oppressed people, right? Like, and I think about if we transpose that to the United States, all the people who have immigrated to the United States, who were othered, who were discriminated against, and if they could become white, if they could eventually become white, then they just take on the oppressive notions and do it to other people.
Yeah.
Like, why don't we learn as humans to do better as a collective? That we don't have to have someone at the bottom.
Is that about being unhealed? Like, I've been thinking that exact question. Is that about being unhealed, or is that too simple an answer?
I think it's unresolved trauma, for sure.
Yeah. So how do we fix it, Natalie? That's why you're here. You're here to fix it.
I think we have to be having the conversations, right? Like what Chris was saying earlier, I think we need to be teaching this stuff in schools. Like if we look at countries like Germany, like South Africa, like I have a practicum student here, a trainee who's from South Africa, and she talks about and she's white presenting, and she talks about the way that they talk about race there is so fundamentally different than the way we talk about race here, right? They honor their history and the horrors of apartheid so that it will never happen again. They have real conversations. And it feels like in the United States, we never really, as a collective, have real conversations of owning what happened to the indigenous people,
right?
What continues to happen to the indigenous people, the enslaved Africans, like the exploitation of Asians and Latine people, like over and over again. We don't have these, we just keep doing it to another group of people, We don't learn.
Yeah. I used to hold up Germany until they have been heinous to anyone saying free Palestine.
Yes.
Germany, they teach their Nazi history, not to, repeat that. And then as soon as this started, especially since October 7th, they have been juxtapose that with South Africa that took Israel to court.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you believe that any criticism of Israel is a criticism of Judaism, then that's the path you go down.
Right.
And those things have to be separated. I mean, we've said that again and again and again. And so if Germany has conflated those things, Germany has conflated those things. So, go ahead.
Well, I think the thing that I ask myself all the time, and coming up on this election next week, and I'm going to choose to believe that we are going to defeat fascism, and we still are living with half of this country who wanted to vote for it. And so, Natalie, what are some ways? I don't want to. I'm going to choose to believe, like I said, and then but how do we? Because there still has to be grace for the people. I'm now not talking about the white people in power, but the white people especially, and the black and brown people. There are some who are voting for the story that fascism tells. So how do we hold in our hearts? How do we not become what we hate? Like you said, like we keep picking another. I mean, I'm Egyptian. I was born in Egypt, and there is some heinous anti-Black thinking within the Egyptian community, within the Arab community. It's very, and even within the Latin community. I'm sure Chris, you could speak to that. But I'm curious how because that is something we need to think about. What do we do? How do we hold in our hearts away? Because if we cannot navigate that, I mean, we're just going to keep repeating the cycle.
Yeah. Well, I'm a big believer that we don't need everybody to believe in supremacy systems, right? We don't need that. I really like the work of Erica Chenoweth, who does a lot of like nonviolent research and resistance work. And what she says that's so hopeful to me is that we only need 3.5% of the population to be actively resisting supremacy systems, right? And that about half of the population will just go along with the momentum, right? And then there's like another like 48%, 47% that's going to be resisting, like actively or passively. So I kind of think a lot in terms of who's the movable middle, right? And I think so much of this is relational, right? That if people get my book or other books or listen to podcasts or listen to this show, right? That the more we're infusing ourselves with disruption from being asleep and in our comfort zone, and really recognizing the pain that so many of us are living, some of us more than others. And I think building connection and chipping away in our circles of influence, right? Healing the trauma. I think that we need to not cancel people. We need to stay in relationship with people as much as we can. And if we personally can't, we should have accomplices who can be in relationship with people, having those conversations, going to the school board meetings, showing up at town council meetings, talking about stuff at work, talking about our educational system. Wherever you reside, there is work to be done, right? That nobody's going to save us. There's no savior. There's no ideal political candidate. The reality is that the two-party system is steeped in racism. Either one. Some of it is obvious. Some of it is not obvious. So I think the Democratic Party needs to own that there's racism within that party, right? And that they're often targeting the moderate voter, right? And that so much of our society is steeped in whiteness and white supremacy and anti-Blackness, and we have a lot of work to do. So I think this idea, I'm one of the good ones, we need to move away from that. Like every day, what are you doing to disrupt these systems that default to whiteness, that default to heterosexuality, that default to ableism, that default to the patriarchy, default to capitalism? Like, how do we like recognize that day in and day out? And get some joy and some rest in there too, right? Like, we need all of it.
Nathalie, what was the name of the person you cited who gave the 3.5%?
Erica Chenoweth.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, she's done a lot of research like around the world at looking at resistance movements, nonviolent resistance movements. And she says like, we think we need the majority, but we only need a small percentage of people, which could go either way, right? Like the fascist extremists, it's probably only 3.5% of them who are like the extreme, but like the narrative, the momentum, like the people who just go along with it, not recognizing like at the extreme, like this is problematic for you too. Like for the average person, like extremism is problematic.
Yeah.
That's just a nice little piece of hope that I can offer my people here in rural central Pennsylvania, where it is very conservative politically, and my congregation often feels like it is, shouting into the wind and not sure, but that's a little nugget I will save. Thank you.
So, Nathalie, I know that your yoga work has been extraordinarily important to how you've integrated the psychology and the anti-racism training, and so I'm wondering if you would speak to like the body practices that we talked about embodying this, but the body practices that you use and why they're important.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that, because I think for me, I spent so much of my life being in my head, I didn't even know what it meant to be in the body, right? And then I became a trauma therapist, and I realized that we hold so much of our emotions and our traumas and our ancestry in our bones, in our DNA, in our bodies. And so I think whatever physical practices we have, right? I think for me, so much of my work is about befriending the nervous system. Like, how do I realize, some of us are introverts, some of us are extroverts, some of us like lots of stimulation, some of us don't like too much stimulation, right? That some of us, feel quite peaceful in the quiet, and some of us gets very agitated when it's quiet. And so like that's all about getting to know your nervous system. And so I think practices like yoga, the asana part of yoga, or meditation are really helpful. One is getting to know where we hold tension, but also creating ease. One of the things I loved about being on my mat was seeing how the patterns that I do out in the world, I do on my mat as well, right? And so noticing if I hold a lot of tension in my shoulders, or the ways in which I'm afraid to try an arm balance, right? What are the stories I tell myself, right? And then I love restorative practices because I think so many of us are overstimulated, exhausted, tense, and the restorative practices of just being still and allowing the body to start to release the tension and rejuvenate and restore. That I think we live in a very busy hustle, like every minute has to be accounted for, that many of us get seduced or are required to do that in order to just pay our bills, to take care of our families. And so how do we slow that down? And I think I love yoga because you can do intense yoga, you can do relaxing yoga, you can do mindful yoga, trauma sensitive. There's so many different practices, and it doesn't require to be like super athletic. And I think some people like Tai Chi, or some people like Pilates. And I think just walking can be a way to just get the body to move more, to discharge energy, because we're scrolling on our devices, taking in all of this intensity, and that's kind of a freeze response in some ways. And so how do we discharge that energy? How do we move it about so that it doesn't just take root and stay there for 50 years?
What are some, like, if we're sitting at our desk, or folks with maybe some accessibility or mobility issues, what are some things that folks can do right where they are? Like when you said my shoulders tense, I'm like, oh, my shoulders are tense because I've
right, yeah. So I think about just even like starting to roll the shoulders back. Like I will just sit here in Zoom meetings and just be like, or I'll go like stretching the side body, right? Rolling the wrists, doing some half or full neck rolls, just that moment, or putting a hand on the heart, hand on the belly, just to drop in, just to center oneself, right? Like chair yoga, there's so many options to do that. And I think like we could spend hours just sitting at our desks, right? Or looking at devices. And so how do we take a break from that? And how do we get back to nature? How do we get back to like the natural rhythm that we've kind of lost track of because we live in such sedentary lives?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you all for the conversation.
What are some ways you're preparing for the election? I'm just kind of pretending it's not as close as it is, but which is not helpful. I'm curious, are there ways you're preparing even your body?
I've been really trying to slow down and tell myself to hibernate this winter, right? Which means don't say yes to any new big projects. Do something non-work related, like develop some hobbies, take more Zumba classes, take more Pilates classes. I guess I'm thinking about the work I do before the election and the work I do after the election is the same, right? Because the same supremacy systems have been operating for hundreds of years. It's just louder now. We have access to it on our little devices. So to me, the work is the same. Build community, take care of myself and my family, build relationships, keep being a disruptor in my circles of influence, and get more people to read my book so that they can have conversations with other people and build their skill. Like my book is building literacy, fluency, and agility, because I think we have to build the reps, build the muscles.
Yes.
We have to do the repetitions in order to feel more confident. So many people say, I don't know what to say. I don't want to mess up. But like, keep practicing, find your people, and then expand.
Say more about having a disruptor in your circle. I'm curious.
I think we all can be disruptors in our ways, right? I don't even think it has to be loud, right? I think I remember, like, I used to talk in workshops about just naming that a person is white when describing, like, I went to the store and my cashier was white. That's disruptor, right? Because normally we don't even name whiteness as an identity. We assume the person is white. We hear like they're Jewish, we hear that they're Black, we hear that they're Puerto Rican, right? Like we hear these other minoritized identities. So I think that there are ways we don't even realize. It's the everyday little things that make a difference on top of the big things.
It's like I have folks who are insisting on calling the NBA the MNBA because the default is men's sports.
Oh.
WNBA, women's NBA is the WNBA.
Right, yeah.
So the other one should be the MNBA, not the NBA.
Yeah, that's a great example.
If the default is assumed to be the oppressor or the group with power, you have to name the group. Right? So like you name whiteness when you see it. It's a way to not make it the default.
Right.
We pick skin tones for the thumbs up on our Facebook or whatever, Slack, and not the yellow, because the default is a tone that nobody has but everyone assumes is white.
That's right.
So thank you for that. DC had a reaction. Do you want to unpack that?
No. We have 2 minutes left. We do not have time to unpack almost 60 years of family trauma. But I will say I did feel a physical reaction, physical response to embodiment talk. When I was in seminary, I took a class, pastoral care for something, times of crisis, something, I don't remember. It was 3 months after my father died, and the class started with gentle yoga, which absolutely wrecked me. I was not prepared for all of that shit to come out while lying, unsuspecting in my sweatpants on this silly little mat. And it just, I also almost flunked Buddhism for the same thing, because sitting in the quiet sometimes is not a safe place. For me, I'm getting better at it, but boy, howdy, that's exciting. And not in a happy way. But boof. Yeah, I mean, and that's a real thing. And that's part of why I've not ever gone back to yoga. Is first off, there always seems to be a bunch of skinny white women who are doing it to I don't know, fit in those silly little outfits that I don't understand. And it doesn't ever seem to be really trauma informed. And I know that I've had the experience before getting a massage where I just burst into tears. And I don't even have words for it. I don't know why it's happening. And the massage therapists generally are like, yeah, that happens. Stuff gets stored in your muscles and then I release it and you don't know what to do with it. So you cry. It's okay. But still, oof. Yeah. I've got some work to do.
And that's why when I teach in yoga schools, they always want me to teach trauma-sensitive yoga. And I really advocate for all yoga teachers should be doing trauma-sensitive yoga, right? Because 2/3 of the population has experienced some sort of adverse childhood experience, and we don't know what bodies and nervous systems are in that room, and we should be making it so that people don't have those kinds of reactions that you're saying, DC.
Assume that there is somebody terribly wounded in the room.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And to that point, I also just want to give a shout out for our friends out there that we know that bodies come in all different shapes and sizes, and we will wear what we want to wear, whether we think it's silly or looks good or any of those other things. We love you, and
Thank you,
everybody.
Thank you, Chris.
No, I'm there with you, DC. I'm correcting myself as much as anything else. All right.
Well, Nathalie, thank you so much for spending this time with us.
Thank
This has been really wonderful.
Yes.
And thank you, viewers, folks who have been participating in the chat on Facebook and YouTube, and we'll continue to do this as this show remains present there.
All right. Thank you,
everyone. So appreciate this conversation.
Well,
Bye.
Halloween.
Thank you for joining us. Special thanks to those of you who give generously to this ministry. It is because of you that this ministry is possible. You can click the link in the description to give now, or visit clfuu.org/give for more information. We hope you will join us next week for another episode of The View.